Hello, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, college football fans, college sports fans across the nation and around the world. This is Tim May with the Tim May Show, and strong and going as well as ever. And boy, I've got two guests on here, been on the Tim May Show before, both of them multiple times. But Larry James, attorney extraordinaire, who tried to defend the Tatt Five, et cetera, way back in Ohio State football history, and Luke Fedlam, who's Ballywick has definitely become NIL. How do you deal with the NIL, et cetera, guiding people through the NIL marketplace is a wrong term. What would I call it? Spider webs, whatever you want to call it. Luke Fedlam, both of you guys, welcome back to the Tim May Show.
Good morning, Tim. Larry James here. It's a pleasure to be with you after all these years.
Yeah,
Tim, it's always good to see you. I think the word I would use is quagmire, but that
yeah,
might be too big for this morning. But that's what I would use.
yeah. I was gonna say y'all are y'all are still sloshy. Still got your galoshes on from sloshing through some of this stuff. But let's just get with you first, real quick, Larry. You know, you and I got to know each other. Found out we both grew up in the same hometown of Demopolis, Alabama. Well, that wasn't your hometown, but it's where you got sent. You know,
Yes,
on probation way
yes.
back when you were a little kid in the 50s and 60s, but which was coinky dink in its own right. That's a whole nother podcast. But uh, just real quick, every time I think of the NCAA now and its lack of power, it's almost become a toothless wonder in a lot of ways. Just look at what they've dealt with when it comes to the Michigan situation and right on down the line. I just remember back at the height of its power when it really exercised its muscles. Just to make an example, was Ohio State back in the Tatt Five, as we've learned, as we've gotten to call it, in 2010 and 11. And you fought valiantly uh, for some of the members of the Ohio State football team who got suspended. A couple never returned to playing time. But just what is your take on where the NCAA is now from a if power is the best word I would use to like describe whether it has it or not. But what is your take on where we are right now, this juncture?
Well, you'll recall in 10 and 11 on Tattoo Gate and all those investigation, it really was triggered by the Sports Illustrated article. And the magazine Sports Illustrated came out with Ohio State on the cover with Jim Trussell leading them. And I think everybody freaked out. The NCAA came to town, did the investigation, and did a really lousy investigation. And I think that was verified back in 2014 when the Plain Dealer did this article, where are they now, closing the book on Ohio State's Tattoo Gate. And it's like night and day. You'll recall the question with them is whether they had traded favors for getting tattoos. The Sports Illustrated article had 8 players trading for tattoos. 5 of those players didn't have tattoos on their body. The other aspect of it was trading their memorabilia.
Yeah.
And so what we did is we went to the families, the parents, we took a newspaper article with that date and showed that the parents standing there with the kids with all the memorabilia that had not been sold and they still retained it. And so I would say the due justice for the NCAA coming to grips with the abuse of power for all those years
Yeah.
and their absolute denial of giving the kids any consideration for anything. I mean, we had a volleyball player who had gotten a free bottle of water and she self-reported. She felt guilty and she got suspended for a game.
Yeah.
So now we look at them today, and the only thing that's left really is March Madness.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting what happens to that. I saw in today's paper with Belichick down at where he is and, trying to figure out, what's going to be the balance between basketball and football. But I mean, it's sad, but I am 100% in favor of where the players are and where this is headed, irrespective of the insanity that it's left us with today.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the best way of summing it up. I mean, it's we're definitely at a crossroads. We may even be past a crossroads, just people don't know it yet. But Luke Fedlam, you immerse yourself into the name, image, and likeness situation many years ago, and became a forerunner in terms of understanding where this was headed, but also in helping guide some people through, like you said, the quagmire and stuff. Show them where the actual rocks are. As Bear Bryant, used to walk on water at Alabama. No, as he said, he just knew where the rocks were, right? But the bottom line is, I mean, it's number one, explain where we are, because both you guys have spoken to the Ohio State football team. Luke, you several times on, when Urban Meyer started Real Life Wednesdays, where we'd have different guests come in and explain to them, their different things, from enlightening them on history. Here we are in Black History Month, and he'd make a big deal about that too. But the bottom line was, how do you get a grip on your own situation, on your own finances, on your own future, et cetera, and what you can and can't do and stuff. And now, I mean, the question now would be, what can you not do? I mean, and to a certain extent, when it comes to accepting, making deals, et cetera. But where do you think we are? Are we coming out the backside of the NIL transfer portal era, or are we just really, really just right in the middle of the maelstrom now?
We're absolutely in the thick of it, Tim. I mean, there is still such uncertainty. There's no true fair market value. The NCAA has partnered with various third parties to try to create some form of a kind of third-party administrator, repository, so that they can start to figure out fair market value on deals. That's just not happening. So it really is a place where we are, where student athletes are being able to be compensated in ways they've never been able to be compensated before. Transfer portal rule changes allow this real quasi-free agency in college sports. And we're right in the middle of it. And I think a lot of people have looked at this, proposed House settlement, the House versus NCAA case, and the proposed settlement that we're in, and said, well, that should settle things. Well, it's really not.
No.
And what it's trying to do is really settle way more than what the lawsuit itself was about.
Correct.
I think that creates a lot of the challenge that we're going to see even if that were to get approved by the district court judge. There's already been numerous discussions around what those appeals will look like. So we just saw there's a group that's looking for an injunction right now against the enforcement of the NCAA being able to say that schools have to decide by March 1st whether or not they're going to opt in. And so we're waiting on that. So there's so much change that continues to happen. The NCAA doesn't have a control on it right now. It really is kind of the courts that have the control in terms of opening up and creating opportunities for student athletes like never before.
Okay, I'm gonna put
Jim,
go ahead, Larry.
What would be really neat is, particularly those fans of 30 for 30, of today, which you don't know what we're talking about, go back and look at the Pony Express, SMU, and what happened with them and where they are today. And, it's about each university being able to endow a fund to pay the athletes, and not just the football, basketball players, is can you play the rest of the athletes? Right. But it would be neat for your listeners to go back and watch that 30 for 30 on SMU, because it's perfect.
Yeah. Who knew the Pony Express were forerunners? I mean, it'd be back to the future. It really is when you watch that. I mean, it's, I grew up first in Alabama and in Texas, man, in Texas in the late 60s, early 70s. And, just the stuff you heard about was going on everywhere. Was already, but SMU was got sent to the principal's office, and then finally got stripped of and sent home to mama. But the bottom line is, you're right. I mean, it's crazy what everybody, I don't know, back then, I think, they were just skirting the rules just to show they could skirt the rules. You know how people like to have power or feel like they're helping make things happen and stuff. But you're right, now they regard.
And you have to remember, the governor was involved, the Board of Regents, everyone without exception, they were the modern day NIL.
Yeah. And it's really funny now. Jim Trussel's now the lieutenant governor of the state of Ohio. So, you know, it's like, I mean, it's crazy. And, you know, I wanted to ask you this, Larry, you know, back during that time, did you feel as powerless as you found out you were? You understand what I'm saying? Did you feel like you were doing your due diligence and somehow or another, like in a court of law, the evidence would hold sway? You know what I mean? I mean, how frustrating was it then?
Yeah. I did not feel powerless until we got to the conclusion.
Right.
Because the problem with the NCAA process, it's the university's right of appeal. And I'll give you the example with Boone, Heron, and DeVere Posey, particularly DeVere Posey. They were working for Geronimo in Cleveland. So what we did is we tracked their cell phones because it was argued that they had not gone up and worked. Right. So we tracked their cell phones each day that they were supposed to work from Columbus to Cleveland in Independence, where DiGeronimo's operation was, and then tracked them all the way back. So they were there for the duration of the hours. They were there during the lunch hours, and we tracked it. We produced that evidence, and the NCAA just ignored it. The other issue was with DeVere Posey that got the all but one game suspension. He was working on a union job that mandated he be paid union wages. The other student athletes were paid $15 an hour. He was paid $25, and they got him on that narrative. And I'm saying to the university, here it is, appeal it.
Yeah.
And they just, I think at that point, they blinked and they were afraid to take on the NCAA because they were almighty.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they blinked.
So from that standpoint, at that point, I felt powerless because, you know, representing the athletes, you couldn't turn your guns on the university because they were trapped.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, Luke, how old were you then? You were a young lawyer at that point, weren't you? I mean, not just you're not still young. I don't mean it. Don't take that the wrong way. But Larry and I know how old each of us are because, anyway, I touched on that earlier. But what did you make of what was going on back then in 2010 and 11 with Ohio State, and you know maybe a couple of other schools about the NCAA flexing its muscle like really never before?
Well, I mean, really, the NCAA thought that they had all the power, and they did. I mean, and that's one of the things that I think has been so interesting over the last maybe 5 years or so, 4 or 5 years, right? Is that, you know, in the NCAA versus Alston case at the Supreme Court, that was right before, back in 2021, right before the floodgates of NIL opened up. They opened up because of the court saying unanimously. I mean, how frequently do we have a unanimous Supreme Court decision anymore? Right? The court said unanimously that the NCAA is not all powerful and mighty. They don't have an antitrust exemption, and they can't put these caps and limits and restraints on student athletes. And I think that was the first time. I mean, if you go back, the NCAA was in front of the Supreme Court back in 1984, right? And so that period of time from the mid 80s through to really 2021, the NCAA was acting as if it was unstoppable.
Yes.
And whatever it said goes. And here's another good example. If you even look at, you asked the question earlier about the transfer portal. If the NCAA really felt like NIL was going to become legitimate and actually be approved, there's no way they would have made their changes to the transfer portal in 2020. Right? Because what you do then is say, okay, well, we're going to say now in 2020, student athletes can transfer and get a one-time exemption, which is obviously since now out the window, you can get as many transfers as you want. But at that time, you could get a one-time exemption. And then a year later, we start allowing student athletes to receive compensation. You bring those two together and we have this quasi, and that's why I said earlier, quasi free agency, because it's only quasi because we don't actually have a collective bargaining agreement, right? We don't actually have the negotiations for that. So it's quasi because it really is anything can go at this point for these student athletes. The NCAA, with all of its strength and power earlier, that is most certainly gone now.
But and you have to look at the erosion, Tim. Yeah. You know, the one and done. I mean, that's another evolution that took place, that they realized that the floodgates were about to open because, you know, you couldn't draft someone until they were technically in their senior year graduation class, and then it just got eroded back. That's another scenario that they begin to lose their leverage.
You know, And hey, I don't mean to draw this, this is like a an odd segue. It will be perceived as that, whatever. But we're in the middle of Black History Month, and we all know that the fellows who are really making out by, from I think from a majority standpoint of this new NIL transfer portal era, many of them are African American young men, who basically a lot of these football programs once they started taking African American young men, instead of like, everybody made fun of me because, I mean, not made fun of me, but I grew up in the South. Alabama didn't have a African American football player until what, 1970, 71. Same thing in Texas, University of Texas. Jerry Levias, one of the first ones ever taken in the Southwest Conference by Hayden Fry at SMU. Speaking of SMU,
You're right.
SMU did some good things, back then. But my point is now, uh, I don't ever call anything payback because I don't think you can ever really truly pay back for maybe exploiting people earlier in the year. But it is interesting. The African American student athlete has benefited greatly, hasn't he, from a financial standpoint, at least on the major college level, with the new rules, if in fact there are rules. Am I true? Am I correct on that?
Well, listen, yes, I think you're correct. Absolutely. Let's be clear too, right? The universities, the conferences, the coaches, and everybody else has benefited, right, for the decades of
Yeah,
the billions of dollars
exactly.
created on the backs of the student athletes
That was
and the
the
work
old
that they've
system.
done.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you're right. This isn't like a makeup because listen, there are still lawsuits being filed by groups of student athletes of all colors for in history, right?
Yes,
Historically,
yes.
just you look at what was it, 1983 NC State men's basketball team, right? All the players that are still alive from that team, they're suing to say, hey, every single March Madness, you show a clip of us winning the championship and Jim Valvano running across the court and everything,
Yeah.
right? And so we should benefit from that. So I think, but to your question, directly, I would say absolutely. There are so many student athletes across all sports, and so many African American student athletes that have brought so much attention and so much resource to schools and institutions all across this country. And if we're taking this time in Black History Month to acknowledge that, then the fact that student athletes can now earn compensation for all that they've brought to the sports industry as a whole is significant. Without the exploits of the student athletes, you don't get to an $8 to $10 billion, conference multimedia deal. Just doesn't happen.
Yeah, Tim, and I think the subtleties that we have battled all along, and we've talked about this before on the racial issues, and we're in a horrible time period to talk about DEI and inclusion. But I've said the poster child for Americans' history on race and meritocracy is the Black quarterback.
Yeah.
For so many years, that was absolutely a prohibition and a taboo. And then you move forward. So you see these emancipation moments. The other one was in the NCAA rules, and it really caught my attention when Danny Ainge played baseball and got paid for it in the amateurs. But the Black athletes were not the traditional athletes that played two sports that could be compensated, and those individuals were exempted.
Yeah.
And when we did the tattoo gate, I remember saying that these athletes were indentured servitude. And I got killed by the national press. And the Atlantic came out, and I can't remember the reporter, I can't remember his last name. He came out and he had the photograph of the Black athlete, football player, with the numbers across as if he's in prison. So, everyone wants to forget the inhumane poverty. These kids coming out, many of them, in their economic situation. So, it's long overdue. And I think America finally is starting to adjust. Now, it'll be interesting to talk about the transfer portal, because that's what is, I don't want to say it has people confused. It has them conflicted.
Yeah.
And that's where we're trying to figure out what happens. But when you see the quarterback leaves Ohio State and goes and, LSU and, becomes the Heisman Trophy winner and all, I mean, that's just fairness.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Hey, Luke, you delve in that realm like few others. You know, we could sit here and talk all day, but I wanted to ask you this. Let's talk about the future and stuff. What do you see coming down the pike that gets for want of another term, allows schools or whatever governing body ends up coming out of this in 5 or 10 years to get a grip on what's going on uh, from the standpoint of people out there in the public being able to understand it. But number two, I've always said the word that nobody ever wants to talk about is the word contract or contracts. And we've talked about that before here on this show with you and stuff. But well, what do you what's the end game 5 years from now? What are we looking at from a landscape? Is it? I don't think the current, like the word I would use. I don't think this is sustainable right now based on just how wild west it is. I mean, even the powers that be trying to get changes made. Just in who can qualify for the college football playoff tournament, you know what I mean, and stuff,
Sure.
and how the big powers deserve to have so many in there and stuff. You know what I mean? I mean, we're still in flux big time here. But where are we 5 years from now, do you think, in terms of NIL and governance there, if in fact there is governance there, or at least sanity there?
Sure. So I think a few things. Number one, I would say this is absolutely the most consequential decade in American college sports, period. Right? I mean,
Yeah.
if you think about it from 2020 transfer rule portal changes, 2021 name, image, and likeness, and you asked about the next 5 years, a lot of this is going to be figured out in the next 5 years. So I think the 2020s, right, as a decade will absolutely go down in history as the most significant changes that we see. I think that ultimately college football drags everything else along with it. And to your point earlier, you've got the NCAA that's responsible for March Madness. But then they're responsible for championships of all sports except for football. And the only thing with football that the NCAA touches is really, quote unquote, enforcement, right?
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
we start to look at where things are at with, in particular, the Big Ten and the SEC, I think most people realize college, as kind of colloquial as this term may be, college football may be too big to fail, right? No one wants to see college football fail. And I think that ultimately what we're going to see is, I think that we're going to see some way in which college football kind of gets controlled in its entirety by some third party. That third party could be the college football playoff. If you think about, the CFP going from 4 teams to 12, you look at the revenue increases, right? From $500-600 million to now with 12 teams, a couple $1 billion. I mean, that is a significant change. And so if football itself was taken out and controlled, and Gene Smith had talked about this in the past, others have floated, this isn't a novel idea, but if that were to happen, now you can have a separate body, call it a college football commissioner. Imagine that, which we know names have been floated for that as well.
Yep.
Now they could control, now the rules could come around that are specific to football that don't have to be considered for synchronized swimming, for softball, for lacrosse, and other sports. So you could say, what are our college football transfer rules? What are our college football payment, revenue share, et cetera rules, right? So these are things I think that we could see. Now, obviously, we've already experienced significant change over the last 5 years. I think the next 5 years for something like that to occur, I think it causes people to really have to readjust kind of what their thinking is of college sports. This antiquated notion of we've got these, athletes that come in and they want to play their sport because it's a pathway to get a great education and get a degree, and that's what matters, and all this, and the money shouldn't matter and all that. That's out the door. That's gone. I think that was out the door when we started looking at these $100 million plus college coaching contracts, et cetera. So I think that what we're about to experience is football doing what is best for football, and then everything else just, kind of working itself out.
What do you think, Larry? I mean, you've got
I
insight
think,
into all
yeah,
this from the inside out, you know?
I think that I would ask Luke this, because the wild card is still the athlete.
Yeah.
And whether there's going to be a collective bargaining agreement, because you're still going to have the potential of an antitrust violation that you're going to try to, get them down. And that's what I haven't been able to get my head around is all these different options. What role will the athlete play? because, and there are certain coaches that said, you're my A player, you're my B player, and you're my C player. And everybody has to receive some compensation to make this system work. And it gets overinflated. So my big question, maybe I'd push back and ask Luke this, is what is the role of that athlete?
Yeah.
Are you going to require them to attend schools, or is it going to become some subsidiary of the NFL because it is that glorified farm team? And that's where I can't get comfortable to say, here's what I see happening.
Yeah.
You think?
I think. Sorry, Tim, we've taken over your show, man.
No, it's good. That's what I wanted.
But
This is
that's
like being inside the Supreme Court when they debate. Go ahead now.
Yeah. So I think that is one of the number one questions, is what role does the athlete play in this? Now, there are numerous efforts happening currently around the unionization efforts of athletes. I will say this. And having spoken to student athletes all across the country, different teams, different institutions, different sizes of schools, it is rare for an individual athlete to say, I really want to collectively bargain. I want to unionize. I want to do all these things, right? Typically, it's kind of the quote unquote other adults who are not the student athletes that are pushing, right, this notion of collective bargaining. But I think that there is clearly a place for the voice of the athlete that needs to occur. And I think, when we look at one of the last things that Kevin Warren did on his way out, when he left the Big Ten, was he started talking to some of the quarterbacks in particular around the Big Ten, talking about what could some revenue share look like, what could, some of these other ideas that are put forward in the notion of unionization and collective bargaining look like. So I think that most certainly is going to continue to happen. We've got some court cases that are trying to deal with that. But one of the things that we've seen from a congressional perspective is this notion of really not wanting to allow student athletes to be employees. And as Ted Cruz now, since as the Republicans have control of the Senate, Ted Cruz is now responsible for the Commerce Committee. And he's been very vocal about wanting to get involved in college sports. Imagine that, a senator from the state of Texas wanting to make sure that they were involved in college sports, right? Makes perfect sense there. But I think that there's not so much an appetite for student athletes to be considered employees, which creates some challenge there. But there's most certainly, I think, a desire for the student athlete's voice to be heard. Now, to Larry's point, if there's been conversation, there's been various, ideas floated of what if it is some subsidiary entity, whether it's owned by the NFL or some other group, private equities trying to get involved in college sports. That's a whole other conversation. But if that were to occur, we know that schools would then license their logos, license their marks. So you still have, the Ohio State Buckeyes still being the Ohio State Buckeyes, right, by licensing. But then if that were to be the case, then what is the requirement? And I think if there's no school connection or no academic connection, then it really does become a pure farm team, which I think is most certainly different from what anyone is expected. But I think the main difference between the NFL and their collective bargaining and their situation versus college is that the NFL, even though the average career length is 3.5, 3.6 years, you still have those players that are the names that are there year after year after year that are involved in these conversations, right? Back in that 2010 or 2011 CBA negotiations, when you had the, Peyton Manning and Drew Brees and others trying to lead the charge, but you've got these other players saying, hey, you're the ones out here making a ton of money. We need somebody to make sure they have our voice because we're the ones that are the average, type of player. But in college, think about it. If it's college, you've only got the 4 years. So you've got maybe 5. You've got players that are cycling out and there's not the longevity. So certainly some challenges. And
I think the other side of that, Luke, Tim, is that now athletes are staying in school for another year because they have NIL, and they can make perhaps more than the minimum. The other thing that is a wild card is the National Labor Relations Board, because we've had a number of challenges whether students working at universities are employees and can they unionize.
Right.
And under the Trump administration, I mean, it just depends on, you're going to see, I think, appointment process of those members who will say no to that situation. So at least for the next 4 years, you're going to have that body who says, no, they are not employees. And then depending on what happens in the next 4 years, if that body doesn't change, unless the court's going to preempt and say, we're going to make the call and the Labor Relations Board is not. So there are a lot of nuances, but I think as we look at this, I think students for at least the near future are finding some peace because there is some compensation that helps them and their families.
Yeah. I mean, you just hit the nail on the head too. I mean, from the standpoint of, I mean, you and Luke both, y'all both got the same hammer hitting the same nail coming from side, different sides. But the bottom line is it's almost like you see a separation of, church and state. You see a separation of football from everything else because football,
Right.
I mean, you ask Ross Bjork, the athletic director of Ohio State. I mean, you got to keep football healthy, man. Football's got to be thriving no matter what, just to pay the bills for one of another term and to keep the revenue coming in and stuff. And I just wonder what that world's going to look like when I grew up, rooting for Alabama, when I was a little kid and stuff. I knew Joe Namath was going to be there for 4 years when they signed him out of
Yeah.
Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania. Now, how that happened, you know what I mean? College football has always been an interesting quagmire. But the bottom line is, I knew he was going to be there for 3 or 4 years if he was going to play college football. And now you got guys coming in, staying a year or two, and maybe moving on somewhere else and stuff. And that's the reason I brought up the word contracts, because I don't know how you really truly get a grip on something with, like you're talking about, Larry, totally remaking it where it and you weren't saying this, but you kind of were, when you bring the National Labor Relations Board into things.
Yeah.
And you bring collective bargaining into things.
Yeah.
And as Luke pointed out, you can have a football player who can be on your campus now 6 seasons. That's almost twice the length of an average National Football League career. But should college football be a career? I mean, you know what I mean?
At least, I think, Tim, at least it should be contract, because we
Yeah.
see situations right now where an athlete signs for 100,000, that athlete takes the money and they bolt to another one and you can't get it back.
Yeah.
And you'll remember Eric Dickerson showing up in that Gran Torino, and the school had bought him that car. And, SMU says, they can't do anything. What are you going to say? I bought him, but he didn't stay bought?
Right. Right. Exactly.
So you have that situation right now.
But you have his contract on file, down the, that's what I'm saying.
So
Go ahead.
I'm going out recruiting this 5-star athlete. I'm paying him, X number, hundreds of thousands to sign. And 2 weeks later, he takes the money and goes, oh, by the way, I'm going to Texas.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think about that, Luke?
That, to me, that has to be addressed. It has to be addressed.
How do you address it, Luke?
Well, there has to be some standardized contracts, and that's the challenge right now. I get a chance to review contracts all the time, and they're all over the place. Collectives are not created equally, right? Collectives have all different kinds of contracts, and now schools, again, assuming that everything from the House settlement does go through, then you've got schools that are going to engage in contracts directly with student athletes, and those are there's gonna have to be some standardization. I mean, that's what makes the NFL, work in some respects, is the fact that you've got this standard representation agreement. So if an agent's going to represent a player, it's a standard contract, and they just fill in 1 or 2 blanks to make it, unique to that situation. And I think, right now, though, it's such an overused term, but Wild Wild West is the only way to describe it. I mean, from a contractual perspective right now, it's all over the place. It really is. And so I think, we're going to have to see some standardization of that for kind of the ongoing future.
I've put forth with you guys before, talking with you, the interesting thing about the college athletic situation right now in football, especially in basketball too, really. I mean, let's face it. But the NCAA kicked the can. The NCAA, by the way, I hope people understand, it's not just this bastion over in Indianapolis. I mean, it is Texas, it is Ohio State, it is Alabama, right on down the line. that is the NCAA, but they kicked the can about compensation down the road so far that they looked into somebody else paying the players for a while. You know what I mean? And with the NIL stuff, and now you're right. I mean, so that's why I wanted to finally ask you when you get right down to it, in the new way of doing things, if you're compensated. Coming up in revenue sharing aspect from the schools, just the revenue sharing part, not NIL aspect. Aren't you in fact an employee of the school or of the athletic department? Or why wouldn't you be if you're getting a check from them? If you understand what I'm saying, I mean, isn't that a ipso facto? That's not even the correct term, but I'm going to use it anyway. Isn't that an ipso facto contract if I'm paying you for services?
It's definitely an implied contract. And
there you go, implied, yeah.
Yeah. So you have the situation where if you're an employee, then you have workers' comp. Now, most university on your major athletes, you're taking out an insurance policy, or the athlete's taking out an insurance policy on him or herself, to avoid being injured. But clearly, in that situation, you're signing a contract, and you're at least, you could be, if you're trying to skin this cat, you could say you're an independent contractor.
Yeah.
You could go that way as opposed to being an employee. And I don't know how you come down on that. I think you want to have, I think, as Luke was saying, a universal contract that applies as opposed to having the independent contractor status that, because one size is not going to fit all.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge, right? Because on the independent contractor side, which is what we see for kind of traditional NIL deals, when it's coming from a school, you've got to be so careful with that, because it's not just because you're not an independent contractor just because I say you are, right?
Yeah.
You're an independent contractor because you're also treated that way, you act that way. And the argument that a lot of folks have been making by having student athletes is that the school does control. The school controls when they travel, they control when they eat, they control when they, study, when they play games, etc. Which
the working conditions.
Yeah.
The working conditions.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So that creates the challenge there.
Okay. Last thing, I just wanted to ask you about leading to this. I mean, the transfer portal sounds all well and good. I remember asking Justin Fields when you were in there, man, were there bright lights and stuff, when he was trying to come from Georgia to Ohio State and stuff. And it was pretty funny from just figuring out what a guy feels like when he's in the transfer portal and stuff. But we all know now there are great examples of guys going into the portal and never coming out, never being tapped. Never finding that grass is greener on the other side. I mean, they just get lost. Some of them, now I'm sure are encouraged to, hey, hit the portal because you're not going to play here, right? You understand what I'm saying? So it's the portal sounds like this great thing, but it hasn't been for some student athletes and stuff. And I guess if you were counseling student athletes now in this realm, I don't know, what would be at the forefront of your counseling? I mean, what would be at the forefront of your message? Because you still want to come out of this, but even back in the day when they were being exploited from the standpoint of not getting compensation, you were still getting, if you stuck to your guns, you could still get a college degree of some sort. You know what I mean? At least you had something to show for it if you put in the effort in that regard. But I don't know, what would be your counseling point for these young student athletes now coming up into this system?
Yeah. I mean, listen, I start off by saying you've got to understand your situation. And one of the challenges when you said, people are telling them, hey, you should get in the transfer portal. Who are those people? Yeah. Oftentimes they're people that are agents that are trying to say, hey, I'm going to get you to another school where we can get you some collective money. And the agent wanting to get their cut of that, not necessarily caring if that player becomes the next, great player, but oftentimes you've got players, especially at mid-major schools, right? That somebody's in their ear like, hey, I can get you up to the P4, I can get you deep, all this kind of stuff. And that's a challenge, right? Because the player, everybody loves hearing it when people say they're great.
Yeah.
Right. And then until they're not, and they're sitting in the transfer portal stuck. And I think there's a significant, there's got to be, we talk about, these contracts with the players and things like that, right? But we also have to think about all of these people that are playing a role around the athlete. Those are some challenges and challenging times too, because there are so many agents that are trying to game the system for their own benefit. And oftentimes it's the student athlete that's the one that gets hurt on the back end of that.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing too, and I can't remember the school or the athlete, that there were commitments made. I think it was the quarterback out west there. The
Yeah.
commitments were made, and they didn't honor that commitment. They did
Katie
not have a
Masada, yeah.
signed
Yeah.
document. I think that was another extraordinary situation, because you have these boosters, and as Luke was saying, all the people, the agents, the boosters, and the coaches. And the question was, did you make that commitment to the player to get the player to come here? And
Yeah.
the answer was yes, but we don't have the money to pay him. That's the other situation. And I think that's where we need the contract, so that everyone's better protected. There's certainty, there's clarity, and there's expectations that have a legal consequences.
Hey, you guys work for the same law firm, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Do y'all have contracts? No, I'm just messing with you. But I don't know.
Well, I want to say, I'm an equity partner. I'm an owner.
Yeah,
So.
there you go. There you go. Oh yeah, there. Yeah, I've read The Firm and all those novels. I understand how that works.
But let me just say this. I mean, we used to be Crab Brown James, and we were acquired. We didn't merge. It's a 240-person lawyer law firm in 5 states, and Luke joined us this year. We've been Amundsen Davis since January of '01. And, we deal with the same uncertainty from year to year with compensation based on your performance.
Yeah.
It's that sort of thing. So from the athlete's world, if you do that, what are going to be the metrics by which the athlete is going to be evaluated to be eligible? Your coaches, we see what they get by the way of bonus and performance and wins. You make a win in the post, the championship game, and so forth and so on. So that's the other nuance I think we're going to get to, because someone's going to pay someone $1 million in year one, and then they get injured in mid-season.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, Luke, you immersed yourself into this NIL transfer portal world. I mean, and you saw the forest for the trees. I mean, right? I mean, are you glad you did? I mean, from a lot of aspects, obviously it can be lucrative for you, but the flip side of it, pardon the expression, lucrative, but also there are people wandering in the wilderness right now who really don't have an idea, right? I mean, even schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad that I'm in this space because the whole reason I even wanted to become a lawyer, right, is to be able to protect people, to help people, right, to help them navigate complex and challenging things. And this is most certainly just that. So whether I'm working with a company and their executives as they navigate a corporate strategic transaction or a merger or acquisition, right? It's that same desire to want to help families and athletes navigate the complexities of name, image, and likeness, and really the business of college sports that we're now in. This is oftentimes it's the first time a family has ever navigated the space. And it doesn't matter, kind of what experience you have in life. It's kind of going through it for the first time for a lot of these families. And so the opportunities, to be able to help be able to advise has been big. So I saw the forest through the trees, but I'm gonna tell you what, there are a whole lot of trees. And so as we're navigating these families, kind of around the mines and the trees and all the things in the way, that's really the joy of what I
think the other thing that Luke does, and a part of it, and I've seen some of the clients come in, is prepare for their future. I mean, one of the things, and this was another 30 for 30 with the star athletes going broke. So you get X number, from $250,000 to $1 million. How do you plan for your future? How do you invest? How do you protect, your assets? So a part of that, what Luke does, which is really tremendous, is put this safety net around an athlete, not only from day one of getting the NIL money, but getting a financial planner, investing, and put the safeguards, around that athlete and that family, because, particularly the traditional star black athlete in football, the first thing he does is buy a home for his mother.
Yeah.
And, you've got all these relatives and things of that sort. How do you protect them? So that's also a part of what Luke does in the enterprising. And, hopefully that gets better. I mean, when we look back what Urban did on Real Wednesdays was the idea of preparing these athletes to be not only citizens, to be financially able to manage their portfolio.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Hey, last thing I want to ask you guys, because these are rare moments for me, but I wanted to ask you just from a specifically, that's easy for me to say, specifically Ohio State. How, just in general terms, how has Ohio State handled this new era, from y'all's vantage point? In other words, is it trying to stay ahead of the times? Is it keeping up? Is it falling? You understand what I'm saying from a
Yeah.
standpoint of dealing with these new parameters. First, you, Larry, how would you say Ohio State has handled this new era?
I'm going to say something funny because there are two major points. This is the second one. I think it was John Cooper when he was at one of the noon lunches, and they said, "What's your problem?" He says, "I got too many slow white guys."
Yeah.
So Ryan Day's thing is, I need $13 million. I
Yeah.
need $15 million.
Yeah.
So Ohio State had the highest paid roster in the country. So from that standpoint, it's been ahead of the curve, and I think it's had that foundation. The other thing I think in the consequences we haven't seen, not to get political, but with this administration, if colleges and universities no longer have to honor the Equal Rights Amendment and women's sports and those dollars, because that's why Ohio State's tried to do what they do to subsidize these other sports. If politics is going to say, well, you don't have to do that anymore, that also is a wild card out there. But I think to answer your question specifically, Ohio State's ahead of the curve.
How about it, Luke?
Yeah, listen, I agree. I've had the opportunity to see a lot of different institutions up close. In Ohio State, they're going to continue to lead the charge, and that's kind of been the brand of Ohio State's athletic department, one of the top athletic departments in the country. But very specifically, though, right? Not just generally speaking. I mean, because there are a lot of questions, there are a lot of unknowns, but you can't allow the unknown to paralyze you from moving forward. Still got to play football games. You still got to drive, the institution and the athletic department forward, but with folks like Logan Hiddle, Kerry Hoyt, and obviously led, by Ross, and the way he was able to transition with Gene Smith and step right in and keep moving forward. He's, currently the president of the National Association of Collegiate Directors of Athletics, NACDA, right? So he's constantly a leading voice out here in some of these changes coming to college sports. So Ohio State's going to lead the way. The challenge that they're going to continue to face, like every other school out there, is what does the future look like, and getting agreement. I do think, just to expand it a little bit more than Ohio State, when you look at the SEC and the Big Ten, if they really, if their kind of working group really comes up and says, this is what we're doing with college football, it's going to be hard for others not to follow.
Yeah.
No, and I think the other thing, Tim, although Ohio State has been on the head of the curve, the pressure here is like the pressure nowhere else.
Yeah.
And we saw that with Ryan Day and the ugliness. And I can't help but think that some of that led to coaches going other places. I mean, the pure pressure of success is debilitating. I mean, it's crippling emotionally, because not only does the coach get affected, but the family gets affected. And what this gigantic monster has created is an appetite for perfection.
Yeah. And
that's the scary part about it.
Yeah. You agree with that, Luke? I mean, it is interesting, right? I mean,
yeah,
but you're being compensated very well. That's what other people on the other side argues. Go ahead. Yeah.
That's it. No, you're absolutely right. You get compensated well, but at the same time, to Larry's point, I think, one of the things that when you talk to folks, especially at kind of that highest level, oftentimes the feeling of, the pain that comes from defeat is oftentimes greater than the joy of the successes you get, right? It's almost like the success just becomes the relief, like, whew, thank God we did it, right? But then what happens? 2 days later, less than 48 hours later, now you got to go capitalize on that. You got to try to retain the people in the roster you need to retain, go recruit more folks, right? And even just, looking at Rick Pitino, right? Basketball coach at St. John's was talking just in a press conference yesterday, the day before, he's got 3 guys that are going to be leaving. He was just like, we're not we're not recruiting high school players. If we want to compete at this top level, we can't go out and recruit high school. We got to go into the transfer portal. We got to go find people. So the changes that have come for coaching at the college level is significant. And I think there's a generation of some coaches that have said, you know what, I'm going to back out. I'm an X's and O's person. I don't want to deal with all this stuff. And others who decide to stay in the fight, that want to keep, trying to move forward. I think that pressure is unlike any other. And again, to your point, it's what you get compensated for.
And Nick Saban's a perfect example of that. But I have 4 tickets to every Ohio State football game. And I think I haven't been to a game in probably 3 or 4 years because, if you've been up close to it, you feel the anxiety of not winning the right way or winning sufficiently. Not only do you have to win all the games, you have to kill your opponent. And the Ohio State fan base is as fickle as hell on that point.
Yeah. I agree with that. But you know what? That's what fanatics, that's what fan is short for, right? And you understand. Like I said, I grew up a college football fan, and I the last time I cried though when Alabama lost a game, I was 12 years old. You know what I mean? I got over it, from the standpoint of it meaning that much. But I got to have a bonus question here following up on that though. Are either of you or both of you impressed by the way Ryan Day handled the situation post November 30th, from December 1 to January 20? That was one of the great coaching jobs I've ever witnessed, maybe the greatest coaching job I've ever witnessed, because it finally does come down to mustering the troops, right? Whether they're compensated or not, to get them to play for a common cause and exert themselves. How impressed, Larry, were you, being a season ticket holder, season tickets holder?
Yes.
How impressed were you with that job that he and his staff, but finally it does come down to the head coach of making it happen. And then Luke, you follow up on that. Go ahead. And we'll be done.
I think I just held my breath for him. I think he was a perfect gentleman about it. He didn't complain about it. But here's the reality, and I would look at the situation in Cleveland with Watson, who was, guaranteed the $260 million, and when he got hurt, people cheered. It's just, you got to deal with it. So I applaud him. You wonder how anyone subjects himself and their families through that anxiety attack. It's incomprehensible to me.
How about you, Luke?
Was it Denny Green that was like, they are who we thought they were, right? Am I impressed? It was an impressive run by the Ohio State Buckeyes. But Ryan Day is who we thought he was, right? He's a good coach. He's the coach of one of the top, now I can say the top football team in the football program in college sports right now. I'm impressed at what the team did, but I've known Ryan Day for years, right? And he is exactly, yes, he had a tough loss against Michigan. But this notion that oh man, all of a sudden he just turned things around and wow, that was impressive. No, he's what, 70-10?
Yeah.
Come on, if you 80 games ago, if you said, hey, we're going to bring in a coach that's going to go 70-10, anybody's going to say that. Now, to Larry's point, yeah, you got to win the right ones, right? Get that. Yeah. Totally understand that. We are a fickle bunch of fans, if you will, but at the same time, he is a good coach, right? He's a very good coach. And I think what he did was recognize the changes and the adjustments that they needed to make in their game plan, and kept the players, and I think this is the hard part, right? Kept the players' minds right to be able to go out on a run. And he did that thing where, hey, he rallied the troops. He brought them in to say, we can do this. And boy, did they do it. If you think about that 4-game stretch, incredible.
Yeah. But here's what I would say to you, Luke, Tim, on that, because ESPN crucified Ryan Day.
Yeah.
And the question was, I'm not sure he will ever get the credit he deserves for this run. And I'm not astute enough about football to answer this question. But when you have a roster in college football with that price point, you damn sure should win. You're expected to win. You were projected to win by at least 2 touchdowns without exception. So what were you doing in those 2 losses?
Yeah, right.
That was the question about this, the level of coaching, because all you need to do is turn the horses loose and they would take care of themselves. I'm sorry, but that's the reality. So we still don't know how good Coach Day is, because it's like the coach from Michigan said, he was born on third base.
Yeah. Well,
And that's true.
yeah.
And he's
Yeah.
got a stable of thoroughbreds. So let's see what happens when maybe you don't have the superior talent on the field. And I'm not disagreeing with Luke per se, but that's a question mark.
Born on third base, but he still scored. And
He
that's
sure did.
That's what everybody wanted.
And
Just
you know
as long
what?
as you score, I don't care where you were born.
Just like Buster Douglas, man, 35 years ago in Tokyo, I'm sitting there ringside when he got up. You know what I mean? He got up and then beat Mike Tyson. I mean, it was very comparable. I mean, it was like he had him under control. Then he gets knocked down in the 8th round. He gets up and beats him up.
Tim, let me ask you this. I mean,
he took a punch, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, you're right. But you've been, in this place forever. So you answer that question about a multi-million-dollar roster and the coaching job. What's your take on that?
All right, here's my take on it. You're sitting there and that multi-million-dollar roster you're talking about. And by the way, I don't know. I mean, there's some other places around the country that are comparable to that. Let's put it that way. I mean, you could name a bunch of them: Georgia, Texas, run them down the line. We just don't know their numbers. Ross Bjork gave us Ohio State's numbers. But the bottom line was, okay, you've got this collection of players, the core of which came back to Ohio State. And yeah, NIL helped bring them back, but you've got this collection of players, and they really for want of another term, underperformed to a certain extent through the first 12 games of the year. But you're in the playoff, and here's the thing: with that players only meeting plus Ryan Day, the day or two after the loss,
Right.
could have gone any way, man. You're talking about guys now are being compensated no matter whether you win or lose, right? Just like in the NFL. And instead, you had the maturity in that room, which I do believe is fostered by how Ryan Day treats his players and his coaches, was fostered. And instead of becoming a hand grenade, they went the other direction. And literally, like you said, stomp the competition like we all thought they would the entire year. That was as impressive a run against quality competition as there's ever been in major college football, ever. Tennessee, Oregon, who you lost to in the year, Texas, who a lot of people thought was the best team in the country from a talent standpoint going into the year, even with Ohio State. And then, of course, the national championship game against Notre Dame. And Notre Dame's throwing some money around, by the way. I mean, let's don't be idiots here. But the bottom line is, that's what I'm talking about, is at that moment of truth, everybody talks about the Alamo in the moment of truth. Well, the Texans lost that one. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
But it inspired others. This is not remember the Alamo. This is more like well, I'm not going to say that out loud. I had a bad thought go through my head. But this is more like, I don't even know what it is. More like Revenge of the Nerds or something. They rose up, you know what I mean? And took care of business.
Tim, do you think that last game of the regular season next year, how will we do against Michigan?
I think they should have beaten them this year.
Yeah.
So, but there was a lot of happenstance. You go back and look at that game. Like, sometimes it's just not meant to be,
Yeah.
I mean, I could name you 5-6 plays that tilted that game. But with Michigan, Ohio State will have the more talented roster from top to bottom, just like it did this year. And you still got to get it done. But fellas, we're in that new era. That's what we've been talking about for an hour.
That's right.
You don't have to beat Michigan to get to where you want to go.
That's right.
I mean, you want to win the Big Ten championship, right? And that's kept Ohio State from even playing for it the last 4 years. But Ohio State just won the national championship with, like I said, the most impressive run, unprecedented run So, that's the new era people also have to get a grip on from the standpoint of reality. I mean, you don't have to. It ain't like the good old days. The good old days are long gone. Agreed?
Absolutely.
No, they are. They are. And not to open another can of worms, so we don't have to go there, but Ohio State played more games than it's ever played in a season ever in history, right? So you want to go on that run, you talk about the wear and tear and the impact on players and why, players' rights matter, et cetera, because you're asking them to do a whole lot, right? If you want to go on a national championship run these days, like, you're going to play a lot of games. And that's without Ohio State playing in the Big Ten championship. You could have easily added one more game to that entire stretch, which is crazy.
It is crazy. Hey, we'll get together and talk about stuff again, And by the way, I've always said, the word booster, it starts with boo, BOO. So, I think you're entitled when you are contributing to the cause, which people do in droves now, you're entitled to have your opinion, on things. But, don't be making death threats and stupid stuff like that. That's the jackasses involved, as I like to call it. Ladies and gentlemen, Larry James, Luke Fedlam, attorneys at law, but much more than that, deep thinkers. Thank you again for joining the Tim May Show, fellas.
All right. Appreciate it, Tim.
Thanks for having us, Tim.
See you around. Thanks.